Hello, Tracee. How are you today?
I am fabulous.
So, I'm fabulous as well, and that is because you and I get to have a conversation today, and we haven't talked in a little bit. So, I want to acknowledge that your book came out just a couple of months ago. So, you are still a very recent author. And before I get into 700 different questions that I want to ask you, I'd love for people just to hear a little bit about who you are and then a little bit about your book.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me again, Jen. I love having these opportunities to sit with you. My name is Tracee Hunt, and I am the founder and CEO of Total HR Solutions. It's a full cycle human resources consulting company. And I'm now a new author, of course, of the book Silent Overcomer. Trauma Comes in All Shapes and Sizes. And what's exciting for me is that I had the opportunity to share my story and to be able to share it in a way where I convey to the reader how I took trauma and turned it into triumph, and how it has really been beneficial to me across all aspects of my life. So that, for the most part, it's kind of who I am. I take what I do in stride. It's my passion. Human resources is my passion. Speaking is my passion. So becoming an author was kind of, I think, the next natural step. Would you say, Jen?
100%. I totally agree. And what I think is interesting and unique about your situation is that you are a very successful businesswoman, right? Like you have a lot of years of experience, have a really awesome company, and yet the book that you published, I think on the surface someone might look at that and say, oh, she has this really badass HR company. She's going to be writing a book that has something to do with like her thought leadership around HR solutions. But the reality is that you went in the complete opposite direction and wrote your memoir and your story, which I love the name of Silent Overcomer. And you can kind of talk about that in a minute too. But what I think is really beautiful and profound is that you didn't have to do this. Like you have a reputation to uphold of what people think of you, right? And you share
Right.
all of your stories in here. So how, like, has anyone commented on that in terms of like just that, wow, I didn't know those things about you, Tracee?
Yes, they really have. And it's actually been, I would say I was really concerned at first to some degree after I wrote the book. I think you recall me having a little trepidation about having my full story out there. I felt the book was very necessary because there's so many people out there. And what I believe is that the book is going to become a movement. I believe that there's so many silent overcomers out there. There's so many women and men and different folks who have reached out to me to say, oh my God, my story. Just this week, I got another text message that my story is just like yours. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us have walked around all these years and we've been very successful, yet we had been suppressing so many things and overcompensating for hurts and traumas that had never been really dealt with. So it was both cathartic and therapeutic to write the book. And what was even more exciting was to be able to show how all those things made me the leader that I am. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I became who I am by happenstance. Really, everything that occurred along the journey was tailor-made for me to make me who I am today.
Mm. And so where is the origin of Silent Overcomer? Because we do have some folks on YouTube watching and they're hashtagging Silent Overcomer, which I love so much, Sheila and Beth. So, and it has it's a short, it's quick, it says a lot. Like, when did you have that aha moment that was going to be the title of your book?
It's really interesting because I was going back and forth between different titles. And when I really looked at it, and I was talking to my girlfriend, Sheila, actually, and I was having this, these discussions with myself saying, what do I want people to think when they first read the title? And I wanted it to totally connect with what my real experience was. Mm-hmm. And the mere fact that so many people will say to me, I didn't know, because I was silently overcoming. And so look at how many people silently overcome every day. And some of them just don't realize that they are overcomers, or even if they do, they still have a lot of residue that they haven't allowed to come forth and be healed. And a lot of times I tell a lot of people, there's so much liberty and transparency. When you're not worried about what somebody thinks about you, and you get to a place in your life where you are operating in a healed and whole way, and you think about it right now, we're in a space of DE&I, right? Because of the state of racial unrest and everything that's going on in our country, right? All the hate and everything that's happening in our country. And we as employers, being human resources, and I am going to write that HR book. I think the next book is coming, I've got the title already. It's teed up. I'm already talking about who's going to contribute to it. Right. So it's coming. However, the thing that's happening and what's being said is, allow employees to bring their whole self to work, because that's going to allow them to be more engaged. They don't have to feel like they have to change up who they are. Do I agree with that? Absolutely. But what's so wrong with bringing your best self to work? So many people are bringing their whole self. They're bringing their whole self, and their whole self is still struggling or challenged or having a lot of things that they haven't, and they're dealing with a lot of things that have caused them trauma. And so why not work? And this book is considered a self-help book, whether it's this book or any other book. Find ways to bring your best self to work versus just your whole self to work.
Ooh, I love that. And I love make note that is all part of that HR book, all of the things that you just said. I'm glad that we're recording so we can go back to this later. So trauma comes in all shapes and sizes. I love that this is the subtitle that you ended up opting to go with, because there's so much that can be said about trauma coming in all shapes and sizes. Because there's a lot of books that are about trauma. Like, trauma is a big thing. And I feel like, I don't want to say trauma is a buzzword, because it's not a buzzword. However, it has definitely gained popularity of people understanding what the word trauma means over the last 5 or 10 years or so, right?
Yeah.
So why was it important? And I think you already alluded to this a little bit, but why was it important to acknowledge that it does come in different types of packages?
All my life, I was struggling with different things that had occurred throughout my life. One of the things that I wanted to do was have the reader not feel like, because their trauma wasn't to have been homeless, because their trauma wasn't rape or molestation, nobody has the right to minimize or marginalize anybody's trauma. Trauma is trauma. And I can remember attempting to address my trauma giver, and they would always say, well, you don't know what happened to me. Well, at least I didn't do this. I'm going, hold on, wait a minute. You have the right to be hurt from what happened to you, but you don't get to tell me that what you're doing to me wasn't as or more hurtful. And so we want to make sure that people recognize that whether it's small or big, everybody's impacted differently. And then it ultimately will impact other areas of your life if it goes undealt with.
Yeah, that's so good. I feel like the phrase "the pain Olympics" is something that I've heard frequently. It's similar to that.
No, you're
right?
the one who gave me that. Jen, you gave me that, and I've been saying it. I say, my publisher told me that it's not about the pain Olympics. And I'm like, oh God, I love that. I'm mad that you got to say it first though, because I love that saying. It's not the pain Olympics.
But in this case, it's also not the trauma Olympics, right? Because I think that there's something so validating for so many people, because there are a lot of stories that are very traumatic. But to your point, it doesn't negate the other people who are experiencing trauma, maybe on a more micro level. That doesn't make their trauma any less significant to them. And I love that you've called this out.
Oh, totally. And so anybody who's listening, who's heard me talk about the pain Olympics, you now get to meet Jen, who's the person who gave me that statement, because I've used it a ton on probably every podcast that I've done. And that was the issue. And it's so funny because as a person, we internalize what our pain tolerance is. And people will make you want to believe that because they overcame something bigger than what you overcame, yours really isn't that significant. And so for me, I had to recognize that, because even with my own daughter, a lot of my motivation behind making sure that I could shift these paradigms, not repeat the same behaviors, were because I didn't want to do the same thing that was done to me, because hurt people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I had to even recognize the power of forgiveness. Hurt people hurt people. And I didn't want to then hurt my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And so even I can remember when she was little, I started out yelling because my mother always yelled. She was always a yeller. And so my daughter was really, intimidated by the yelling. So I couldn't then go back and say, okay, well, at least you didn't have this. And a couple of times I can remember catching myself. Well, at least I'm not beating you. But then again, I had to stop and regress and say, wait, the same way my mother gave me the well, at least, I can't give her the well, at least, because she's not getting beaten, but the yelling bothers her. Mm-hmm. So if I'm going to get a better outcome, why not approach her in a way that's going to give me a better outcome? As parents, the one thing I learned is if we step outside of our ego and be willing to be open to hear from our kids, not that they're going to tell us how to parent them, but we got to know that they're human beings and they're individuals, and set our ego aside. Mm-hmm. And it takes more courage to not do exactly what your parents did rather than to do what they did, because of course you've got to answer to why they feel like you think they were a bad parent. I didn't say you were totally a bad parent, but why would I do everything you did if it all wasn't right?
Yeah. Yeah. Brene Brown has a really good video that talks about the at least from an empathetic standpoint of, like whenever you say at least, you are completely minimizing and marginalizing whomever you're saying that to. And it's not something, it's kind of like this difference between like sympathy and empathy. And I think that the image is like there's like somebody in a hole and like,
Mm-hmm.
you're throwing down a rope to help them out of the hole. But instead of like actually just helping them out and just sitting there with that pain with them, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
well, at least you didn't, at least it's not 10 feet deeper. Like it seems like so
right.
ridiculous, right? And like,
right.
And until somebody calls that out and points that out to you, it's not information that we really have awareness to. So I love that you're kind of applying this to a parenting setting too, because it is very easy, as we all do, to repeat the patterns that we were raised in. And it's not until we have that kind of self-realization to reel it in and be like, all right, is this actually helping or hurting the situation? And be willing to dig deep on that.
That's where I thought it was so important to walk through the book in the stages, because it's interesting how when I talk to people, they've got trauma that's been suppressed for so long, they almost were willing to go to their grave with it and just feel like it could never be helped. And because trauma comes in all shapes and sizes, it comes in all different time frames as well. So a person may not have had trauma when they were younger. They may have had the majority of their trauma in their young adulthood. But again, trauma is trauma. And so we want to recognize it for what it is and be able to occupy a space of reframing that trauma so that it doesn't keep us stuck. And that's really what happens. People end up being stuck. And then that's when the overcompensation comes in. I say in my book how everything had to be just so. I had to make sure everything was perfect so that there would not be one thing anybody could hold against me, because I had always felt like I was less than, because that's what I had been told. I would never amount to anything. And so I wasn't going to give anybody any reason to say that I didn't have something that I should have.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we are so similar. And as we already knew that, but like just hearing you say that, I'm like, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I feel like I'm at a place of trying to undo all of my type A personality traits and undo the perfection and undo the need to have things done now. Like it is hard work.
It is definitely hard.
Yeah.
Because we spend all our time. Think about it. They teased me because I would have the placemats a certain number of inches from the edge of the table. And I'll never forget this. And this isn't in the book, but everything was so laid out in my apartment. And I remember, because you have people who are just mean spirited, and someone came over to my apartment and said, "Oh, you do realize that there's a little spot on that placemat." Oh my God. Oh, yeah. So at that point, it wasn't that it was not 2 inches from the edge, but it had a little spot on it. Oh my goodness. They found my one space of imperfection. And so I had to get comfortable with having a junk drawer, get comfortable with not feeling like everything had to be perfect, because people will then find that as a foothold to bring you down.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, people are rough. I unhealed people, like you said, hurt people, hurt people.
Unhealed
It's
people.
such a beautiful phrase, and it's so accurate. And I feel like until you can recognize a hurt person, you can then you once you recognize, oh, that's a hurt person coming,
Right.
throwing whatever at me, then whatever
Mhm.
they say to you really is meaningless. Once you
It's
recognize, like,
totally
oh,
meaningless.
they're in pain.
And you know what you know the epiphany that I had, um, and I was listening to a speaker, and it was so profound. My triumph is my trauma giver's trigger.
Mm.
So while I'm overcoming, and while I'm hoping that the person will overcome as well, because again, hurt people, and then we get caught up in worrying about what people are going to think.
Mhm.
When we get to a place, remember I said there's liberty and transparency,
Yeah.
and we begin to triumph, everybody whose story gets told alongside yours, they start worrying about, oh my God, who's going to know?
Mm.
So now your triumph has become their trigger.
Yeah. And I think I think it was us who were having a conversation at one point of, like, how do you handle, like, if someone that you've written about kind of comes out and says, you wrote about me, but, you changed names and places and things like that to, lessen the identity of the person. And what's so interesting is that the people who've hurt others, and this happens in so many books, is you've done what you need to do as an author to kind of protect them regardless of whether they deserve it or not. But it's their, like, if they come forward and be like, hey, she's writing about me, and you didn't actually say their name, then it's almost like they're kind of seeking that spotlight, even in such a terrible way. Like, they're coming forward as like an abuser or as someone who inflicted trauma on somebody else. And it's like most of the time people would just be like, oh shit, she wrote about me, I'm not going to say anything because no one knows it's me unless I come forward and say something. But there are some aggressors that are so forward about this that it becomes very problematic for people. But it's like,
I haven't really had that challenge because
yeah.
it was very clear who my trauma giver was in my book. I didn't have to name the person at all. The bigger concern for me was that while they're forgiven, the hurtful piece is because when you care about somebody and you love them, they still have the capacity to have an impact on you.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you're more concerned about what people think of you than the fact that I'm willing to forgive you and be healed, that's the bigger concern.
Yeah.
Is because you're more worried about an image
Mm-hmm.
and an ego than the love and the relationship that we could potentially share. Because as I said, I'm over it. I'm healed, but I'm looking at all these people and all these people who are being healed in a shorter time frame than I was. Because a lot of times, if we just know somebody's there and can identify with us, it helps us along our journey. When we're silently overcoming, we don't know somebody's there with us along our journey. So that's why I believe this needs to be a movement that catches on, because there's so many people who can ride the wave and bring people out of a space of having to be overcompensators and those suppressing hurt and things like that are only holding them back.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. And so what is your, I could guess your desired outcomes for this book, right? So it's been out a couple of months, still
Mhm.
very, very new, and you've already gotten some really good positive feedback from people and excitement. And I fully agree that this is the beginning of a movement. But, what is your, like, the wand that you're waving, that you're like, this is what I want people to feel or experience or do differently or know as a result of reading your book?
I want you to know that you are an overcomer. Don't allow anyone to minimize or marginalize anything that has affected you in any type of traumatic way. You are a silent overcomer. All you need to do is make up your mind to reframe those traumas and turn them into something that's going to motivate you to be able to go to whatever your next level is. Turn that trauma into triumph and watch your life of living healed and whole is only just beginning.
Mm, I love that. So we've spoken a lot about your book, and so your website is scrolling along the bottom. So is it still? Are people still able to purchase signed copies from you on your website?
Yes, they can. Absolutely. And I sign all of them. And then someone said to me, why don't you just write one line? I have found that of all the books I've signed, there's a paragraph. And because I connect for some reason with each person, once I hear the name, because they want it signed, it makes me want to sign it in a meaningful way. Because that person who wants it signed, in most cases, it's because they really are connecting to the story.
Yeah, I feel like I've become somewhat of a signature snob, if that's a new term I'm going to coin, because I'm so used to having like every book. Because obviously I publish books, so I have tons of books that are signed, and every author that sends them does write some something that's meaningful to them, to both myself and then those on my team. And then sometimes you get them and it's just their actual signature, and I'm like, oh, that hurts. Like you kind of like expect something more than that. But for a lot of authors, they just sign their name and that's okay too. But
No, I actually
yours
put
is
an
real personal.
inscription. I actually make it personal.
Yeah, we have a fellow PYP author, Jill Yesko, who says that she does that too. Paragraph, she can't stop herself. She just put that in the chat.
Now, I
It's so
can't
true.
help it. I just
I
believe
know.
that people, when you sign it, they want it with something more than just your name. Your
Yeah.
name's on the book. I want to be able to have you feel and appreciate it. And and I'm telling you, I stacked them up in the beginning because there were a lot that I signed, and I sat each night and just signed so many each night.
Yeah. Yeah, and then your hand cramps and like it's a whole
Mhm.
it's an actual thing. Like I eventually just found like a say like a good phrase that is a nice default phrase to go to, so that way it's more than my name. I've got the phrase, but inevitably, as you and Jill just mentioned, it ends up being paragraphs. But I think that's a good thing. It's a good
Right.
problem to have. It
It's
means that we
right.
care.
At least people want it, right?
Yeah,
You
I
could have
agree.
a different problem where you don't have any books to sign.
That is a very good point, and that is not the problem that you have. So that is a good thing.
That's
So
good
if
stuff.
anyone does want to check out your website, it's scrolling along the bottom. And so if someone happens to be listening to this, your name is Tracee with two E's. I know there's a number of ways to spell your name, so it's Tracee two E's lhunt.com. And your book's available on all of the places that they can purchase your book. So are there any final words that you have before we close out?
I just want to say thank you so much. And again, my book lends to personal and professional growth because you've got to grow personally in order to grow professionally. So my mantra is grow the person, grow the leader, grow the organization. And so Silent Overcomer is that book that can help you not just bring your whole self to work, it can help you bring your best self to work.
Mm, I love it. And then, as we discussed, you'll have an HR book out at some point in the
At
future.
some point.
I'm just gonna
Oh, after
reiterate
30
that.
years of this, trust me, it's coming.
Oh, it'll come fly. It'll be a quick birth, I'm sure, when
Awesome.
it is ready. Thank you,
Awesome.
Tracee. It's always good to connect with you.
Thank you so much, Jen. And tell the other Jen I said hello too.
Oh, of course, sure will. All
Okay.
right.